what I think is essential in this whole housing crisis debate is the neoliberal shift we've seen over the last 4 decades. I, as a scholar, have had for many years avoided the term neoliberalism. I've come to the conclusion that it basically disables me in speaking the truth. So I'm now using it, but I'm using it as a descriptive term. Although I do think that the policies that neoliberal politicians and neoliberal governments have rolled out over us have, in the case of the housing crisis, but also other dimensions of life, have been overall on balance negative. Speaking of Western Europe, from the 50s to the 70s, social democratic policies were dominant, and there we see, for example, the social housing building. But then what we've seen from the 80s onwards was that the stress was on personal ownership, and the personal ownership was subsidized, and increasingly things were left to the market, and we can discuss these things further later. The third point from philosophy, and you already mentioned this, Jess, is markets are not just things that exist. Markets are what we as philosophers call social constructions, which means we form them by political decisions. Now, in a well-functioning democracy, this means that the voters decides how these markets are formed. Of course, no democracy is perfect, but the rules and regulations we put on public housing and on the housing markets are political choices. And what we see under neoliberalism is that these choices are increasingly presented as technical choices, that the only rational way to do is this way. But as we see with several examples that I can give later in the discussion, this is actually not true. We can choose to do things differently if we, i.e. the voters, want it. And then my final comment is that I think in this whole debate, economic inequalities are really key. Housing amplifies existing economic inequalities, it makes them worse, but also it creates further economic inequalities, because with this whole stress on private property owning, it's actually inaccessible for the bottom income groups. So that means that, well, there's various dynamics that went on, and we will come to that later, but there have been quite significant distributional effects of the housing policies that we have had that have just increased inequalities, both between, I think the most important one is between income groups, but also between those who have investment income, so capital owners, and those who basically have to work by earning a living by working. And also there's the generational issues, because for young people it's increasingly impossible to get a footing on the housing market. Can I take one more minute?
Go for it.
Okay, so then I'll say what the position is that I want to defend in this panel. I think we must see housing from the perspective of basic needs or human rights. I think that should be the first one. That doesn't mean we should ignore assets, but I think that should be the first one. Because if we leave housing to largely unregulated markets, or actually markets that subsidize home ownership, as is the case in my country, I think we are violating human rights. And if that is the case, then I think there are two main options. Either you say, okay, this is an intrinsic feature of capitalism, so we should move to a non-capitalist system, or you should tame capitalism. I've done work on what's called limitarianism, which means that we should basically reduce inequalities also from the top down, not only focus on the poor, but also trying to reduce how rich the rich are. And that could be one way to tame capitalism and to reduce those inequalities, which might then have beneficial effects on the housing markets too. Because this enormous amount of wealth that investors has basically screws up the housing market for everybody else. Now, there are other measures that could protect ordinary people without much wealth, such as requesting that existing houses can only be sold to families and not to investors, but they can build new houses because we need new houses to be built, or by giving private persons who do not own a house priority over investors when a house is sold, or by limiting the number of houses that people can have. I'm just saying this here to make it clear that there are many options. There are choices, so this is political, so this is value-laden. And what is, I think, definitely the case in my country, but what I understand here too, is that we should rapidly increase the share of social housing and take other measures that address the housing crisis without only relying on profit-maximizing corporations, because they will basically just drive up prices as we've seen in the past. And I'm repeating just when I'm saying the most important thing is not just about housing in general, but affordable housing. Since if people don't have affordable housing, it is a source of stress and anxiety, and hence they can't make a home. So that's, in a nutshell, my view.